The big boy has a nickname problem. Everyone, and I mean everyone, calls it the most powerful steam locomotive ever built. It is stamped on the plaques. It is in the headlines. It is probably the very first thing you ever heard about it. And it is not true. The big boy is the longest steam locomotive ever built, and one of the heaviest, and genuinely one of the greatest machines the industrial age ever produced. But the most powerful? By the two measurements that actually define what power means for a locomotive, the big boy comes in a clear second on one of them, and it is not even close on the other. To understand how the most famous locomotive on Earth loses its most famous title, you first have to understand that the word power is quietly hiding two completely different numbers. This is the trap that snares almost everybody, including a lot of people who really should know better. When we say a locomotive is powerful, we tend to imagine one single quality, some vague sense of strength. But engineers measure locomotive strength with two separate numbers, and the two are not the same thing at all. In fact, they often point in opposite directions. One is called tractive effort. The other is horsepower. A locomotive can be a giant on one of these and a weakling on the other, and until you separate them in your head, every argument about the most powerful steam locomotive is just people shouting past each other with different definitions. So let us pull them apart, one at a time, starting with the one the big boy is genuinely great at. Tractive effort is raw pulling force. It is the answer to a simple, brutal question. How hard can this locomotive yank on the coupler right at the start, when the train is dead still and every wheel on 100 cars is fighting you? It is the grunt that breaks a mile of tonnage loose from a standstill, or that drags it up a steep grade at a slow, relentless crawl. Tractive effort comes from the size of the cylinders, the pressure of the steam shoving the pistons, the diameter of the driving wheels, and the sheer weight pressing those drivers onto the rail so they grip instead of spin. It is measured in pounds of force, and it is the number that sounds the most impressive when you say it out loud. It is also, as we are about to see, the number that fools the most people. The clearest way to feel tractive effort is to picture a weightlifter at the moment of a heavy deadlift. Everything is about that first grinding, static heave, breaking a massive load off the floor through sheer brute strength. It does not matter in that instant how fast the lifter can run a mile. What matters is the raw, low-speed force. That is tractive effort. It is the deadlift number of a locomotive, the maximum grunt it can throw against a stubborn, unmoving load. And exactly like with a lifter, a huge deadlift is genuinely impressive, yet it tells you almost nothing about how the athlete performs once things are moving quickly. A locomotive built purely for that first heave can be a monster at the coupler and a tortoise out on the road. Horsepower is a completely different animal. Horsepower is not force. Horsepower is the rate of doing work, which is force multiplied by speed. A locomotive straining against a stationary train with enormous force is technically producing 0 horsepower because nothing is moving. Horsepower only appears when the train is actually rolling, and it climbs as the locomotive pulls hard and fast at the same time, usually peaking somewhere out at real road speed. And here is the crucial part. Horsepower depends entirely on how much steam the boiler can make, continuously, minute after minute. A locomotive can only keep producing power for as long as its boiler can keep feeding the cylinders. So horsepower is really a measure of how big and hungry and productive the boiler is. Tractive effort is how hard you can shove. Horsepower is how much work you can actually get done while moving. Hold that difference because it is the whole video. If tractive effort is the deadlift, horsepower is closer to what a car person means by the word. Think about the difference between a heavy tow truck and a sports car. The tow truck has enormous low-speed pulling force. It can drag a bus out of a ditch, but it tops out slowly and cannot really run. The sports car could not drag that bus an inch, and yet it can do a huge amount of work at speed, covering ground fast. Locomotives live on that same spectrum. A machine tuned for pure tractive effort is the tow truck, all heave and no pace. A machine tuned for horsepower is built to keep pouring out work while genuinely moving. And on a railroad that has to keep trains rolling to a timetable, that is usually the quality that pays the bills. Force gets the train unstuck. Horsepower gets it there. Now, the big boy's tractive effort is genuinely huge. It comes in at around 135,000 pounds of starting pull. That is a colossal figure, more than almost anything else that ever ran, and it is a big part of why the machine feels so mighty. But almost is the key word, because it is not the record. Not even the record for tractive effort, the number the big boy is best at. There were locomotives that could outpull it badly, and their story is the single most important lesson in this entire subject. It is worth understanding where the big boy's enormous pull even comes from, because the machine really is a tractive effort heavyweight. It rides on 16 driving wheels, 2 sets of 8, with something like 540,000 pounds of the locomotive's weight pressing down on them, which is what lets all that force actually reach the rail instead of just spinning the wheels. Feed those cylinders steam at 300 pounds of pressure, and you get that colossal starting heave. So the big boy is genuinely one of the strongest pullers ever built that could also run at real speed. The only point is that strongest puller and most powerful are not the same crown. And once you go hunting for the actual record holders in each category, the big boy quietly steps down off the top of both podiums. Meet the tractive effort monsters. The Virginian Railway built a class of articulated locomotives, the 210-10-2 type, with 20 driving wheels that could produce something on the order of 176,000 pounds of tractive effort in full, simple operation. Then there was the Triplex, the almost mythical Erie 28882, a locomotive with 3 sets of driving wheels, which also cranked out a staggering 176,000 pounds or so of raw pull. Both of those numbers absolutely crushed the big boy's tractive effort by a wide margin. If tractive effort alone made a locomotive the most powerful, the big boy would not even be in the conversation. The crown would belong to a Virginian giant or a 3-engine triplex. But nobody calls the triplex the greatest locomotive ever built, and the reason why is the punchline that reframes everything. The triplex was a disaster. It had so much tractive effort, so many driving wheels demanding steam, that its single boiler simply could not keep up. The Erie Triplex would empty its own boiler of steam if it tried to run any faster than about 10 miles an hour. The Virginian's version was even worse, unable to hold its steam much above a walking pace of 5 miles an hour. Think about what that actually means. Here is a locomotive with the highest pulling force ever recorded, and it is functionally useless because it can barely move. It could grip an enormous train and heave, but the moment it tried to build any speed, it ran out of breath and died. This is the great lesson of tractive effort. Raw pulling force, all by itself, is a vanity number. A locomotive that can outpull the world at 5 miles an hour is not a champion. It is a very expensive way to almost stand still, which brings us to the number that actually matters on a real railroad. Because a railroad has to do far more than break a train loose. It needs to move that train hundreds of miles at a useful speed on a schedule over and over. And the measure of a locomotive's ability to do that, to move heavy tonnage fast and keep moving it, is horsepower. Horsepower is the metric that separates a machine that can crawl from a machine that can actually run a railroad. It is the number the triplex failed so spectacularly. And it is, unfortunately for the legend, the number where the big boy meets a locomotive that beats it clean. That locomotive is the Chesapeake and Ohio Allegheny, the 2666, built by Lima. On paper, it looks less impressive than the big boy. It is shorter. It has fewer driving wheels. Its tractive effort is actually lower, around 110,000 pounds, well under the big boy's 135,000. By the pub argument standard, the big boy should win. But put both machines on the road and open them up, and something surprising happens. The Allegheny, in testing, produced just under 7,500 drawbar horsepower. The big boy, at its very best, made about 6,300. The Allegheny beats the big boy by roughly 1,200 horsepower, which is a serious margin. On the single number that actually determines how fast you can move a heavy train, the most famous locomotive in the world loses to a machine most people have never heard of. If you are enjoying having a cherished belief carefully dismantled, do me a favor and subscribe. I take these locomotive legends apart and check the numbers every single week. Now let us look at how the Allegheny pulled off that upset, because it is beautifully counterintuitive. Here's the part that should melt your brain a little. The Allegheny had less tractive effort than the big boy, and yet more horsepower. It could not pull as hard from a standstill, but it could do more actual work while moving. How? Because of what sat behind those driving wheels. The Allegheny was built around a colossal boiler and an enormous firebox carried on that distinctive 6-wheel trailing truck, and that huge boiler could generate steam at a ferocious, sustained rate. The big boy has a big boiler too, but the Allegheny's was tuned to be a steam-making volcano, and steam is horsepower. So the two machines represent opposite design philosophies. The big boy poured its resources into pulling force and a balance of speed. The Allegheny poured its resources into a boiler that could feed its cylinders forever. Same era, same problem of moving heavy trains over mountains. Two different answers, and on the horsepower scoreboard, the Allegheny's answer won. If you want the full story of that magnificent machine, I have a whole video on the Allegheny, and it is worth your time. So why did the big boy, being bigger and longer and heavier, not simply win on horsepower too? Because bigger does not automatically mean more powerful, and the big boy was never designed to top a single spec. It was designed for a very specific job, hauling heavy freight at genuine speed over the long mountain grades between Utah and Wyoming. That job called for a careful balance. It needed enough tractive effort to conquer the grade. Tall 68-inch driving wheels so it could run fast on the flatter stretches, and a boiler big enough to sustain a hard pace. The big boy is a superb all-rounder, a locomotive that does many things very well at once. The Allegheny was more of a specialist in raw, sustained output. When you optimize for balance, you rarely end up holding the trophy for any one extreme number, and the big boy is the perfect example of that trade. It is not the champion of horsepower or of tractive effort. It is the champion of doing everything well. And this is exactly why horsepower, not tractive effort, is the number a railroad truly cared about at the end of the day. A railroad makes its money by moving tonnage over the road and getting it there on time. A locomotive that can move a heavy train fast completes more trips, clears the main line sooner, does more real work in a day than one that can only lug the same tonnage at a crawl. Sustained speed under load is horsepower, horsepower is throughput, and throughput is revenue. The Triplex, for all its record-shattering pull, was close to worthless by that measure because a train that arrives at 5 miles an hour has barely arrived at all. When the Chesapeake in Ohio wanted to rush heavy coal over the mountains, it did not want the biggest deadlift. It wanted the machine that could keep the tonnage moving fastest. And that is precisely what the Allegheny was built to be. So if the big boy is not the most powerful, what is it actually the most of? Quite a lot, as it turns out. It is the longest steam locomotive ever built, full stop. That record is uncontested. It is among the very heaviest, trading that title back and forth with the Allegheny, depending on how you measure. It has the highest tractive effort of any of the big, fast, simple articulated locomotives that could genuinely run at speed, which is a meaningful crown, even if it is a narrow one. And it is, without any argument at all, the most famous steam locomotive on the planet, the one whose name a person who knows nothing about trains will still somehow recognize. Those are all real distinctions. Most powerful just does not happen to be one of them. So here is the real scoreboard. Once you stop pretending, power is one number. For raw, tractive effort, the crown goes to the Virginian giants and the triplexes, the deadlift champions that could pull almost anything and outrun almost nothing. For horsepower, the true measure of moving heavy trains at speed, the crown goes to the Chesapeake and Ohio Allegheny. And for length, for fame, for sheer spectacle, and for being the finest balanced heavy freight locomotive that ever turned a wheel, the crown goes to the big boy. 3 different champions for 3 different questions. The mistake was ever believing there was only one question, with only one king. And this is really where the whole confusion comes from. Most powerful is a marketing phrase, not an engineering measurement. It is the kind of thing that goes on a poster, not on a test report. The engineers who actually built and measured these machines never spoke in terms of one vague most powerful title, because they knew it was meaningless. They spoke in tractive effort and horsepower, in pounds, and in the rate of work, because those are the numbers that tell you what a locomotive can really do. The most powerful crown is something the public draped over the big boy because it was the biggest and the most spectacular. And biggest and most spectacular are genuinely true. They are just not the same thing as most powerful. Let me clear out the objections already piling up in the comments. First, yes, the big boy has more tractive effort than the Allegheny. That is correct, and I said so. And the Allegheny still has more horsepower. Those are 2 different measurements, and each locomotive wins one. That is the entire point. Second, biggest and heaviest are not the same as most powerful, and the big boy's genuine size records do not settle the power question. Third, for the real specialists, yes, the Pennsylvania Railroad's Q2 duplex recorded even higher figures, close to 8,000 horsepower, but that was on a stationary test plant under ideal conditions, whereas the Allegheny holds the crown for horsepower reliably measured out on the road. And fourth, the Virginian and the Triplex outpulled everything on tractive effort, but as we saw, they could barely move, which is exactly why raw tractive effort is not the trophy people think it is. So why is the big boy not the most powerful steam locomotive? Because power was never one number, and the big boy does not top either of the 2 that matter. On horsepower, the true measure of moving heavy trains at speed, the Chesapeake and Ohio Allegheny takes the crown. On raw, tractive effort, the Virginian giants and the triplexes pulled harder, though they could hardly get out of their own way. The big boy sits gloriously in the middle of all of it, not the strongest, not the most powerful, but very possibly the best, because it did more things well than any of the record holders that beat it in one narrow category. And maybe that is the more impressive title anyway. The record breakers are remembered by specialists. The all-rounder is remembered by everyone. That is why, when the world pictures a steam locomotive at the peak of the art, it does not picture the Allegheny or the Virginian or the Triplex. It pictures the big boy. Here is my question for you. If you had to crown one single most powerful steam locomotive and defend it, which number would you rule by, tractive effort or horsepower? And which machine gets your vote? Make your case in the comments. I read them. The best arguments end up shaping the next video.